Hi, folks. Eric from Hit Subscribe here, and today I am uh, back home in Michigan after 5.5 months on the road. So it's a little bit of a mess. I haven't necessarily prepared the office with the lighting and the whole setup for recording videos, but nevertheless, the time is here. We actually just got in late last night, so it's kind of a miracle that I have my desktop set up and was back to work. So I'm going to call that a victory and maybe clean the office up a little bit for recording next week. But in the meantime, I have yet another edition of our freelancing Q&A or indie business Q&A that I do here each week. This week, I have an interesting question. I tend to think a lot of them or all of them are interesting, but this one is maybe more like near and dear to my heart in some ways, just because it like kind of speaks to my background in particular. And that is giving strategic advice a good upsell or value add for a freelance programmer? This one I will answer very simply and then go into why. So there's a term for giving strategic advice. It is called consulting. So the question is really, is consulting a good upsell or value add bolt on for a freelance program? And the answer to that question is no, don't do that. It's not that you couldn't. You could probably make that work sporadically in certain circumstances in a half-baked way, but I wouldn't do this, and I'll get into the details of why for the rest of this live stream or video if you're watching it on YouTube. I have in the past, and I'll put up a link if I can remember to and find it. I have talked about the difference between consulting versus programming or doing labor. For the purposes of this video, let me just define that briefly without you going to watch another video. Doing labor, like freelance programming, or if you're a graphic designer or a content creator or whatever it is you do, freelance work is typically labor of some fashion. What you're selling is output. It's a deliverable, but that deliverable is often custom in nature, and it might not be just a single like specific thing. You're really selling kind of your work as the product. You could think of it as a craft. So if you're a programmer, you're selling your programming labor. If you're a graphic designer, you're selling your graphic design labor. You could say that you're selling your code or your logos or whatever, but in a real sense, what you're selling is the labor around creating a deliverable, and it's often a custom deliverable. But crucially, as a freelancer, you are most likely selling your labor. Consulting is when somebody pays you not for labor, but for advice. So consulting engagement is typically helping somebody make a decision, helping somebody lay out some kind of plan of attack for an initiative that they're taking on. It's to give them advice. But crucially, there is no labor involved. There isn't. If there is a deliverable, it's usually a blueprint or something for someone else to execute, whether it's the person paying you or somebody that they've employed or what have you. You are telling them what to do, and they're going and doing it or making someone else do it, but you're not doing it. You're giving advice. So that is consulting. And giving strategic advice, the way the question was phrased, is essentially consulting. So the question of why I say that this is not a good upsell or value add for you as a programmer, I'm going to answer that in two ways. One is that it is unlikely to work, so it's not like good for you. It will work, as I said, maybe sporadically, like you might be able to make it happen every now and then. You won't be able to count on it. You won't have a coherent business if you're trying to do this. It is not a path I would go down for you. The second piece is I would also say it's probably not good for your clients. That's a little more nuanced, but I'll get into that secondarily. And then I will maybe talk about what I would recommend or do instead. Okay, so why won't this work? I have written about this in the past, and I remember giving a piece of advice in an engagement where I was a consultant. So maybe I'll kind of give some examples first of the problem and then talk through the theory instead of like abstractly saying why this tends not to work or why I don't think it would work. So the first one is some number of years ago, I was subcontracting. Actually, there was a company called Pillar Consulting, no longer exists, was bought by Accenture, but they would bring me in to do like true consulting. They would bring me in as a subcontractor under their umbrella, and through them I had some interesting gigs where I would go into different clients and help them essentially make a decision. So in one particular case, I was at a relatively large like international bank, and they had a program that was to build something in the bank's infrastructure, and it was part of an agile transformation that had gone a little bit off the rails. And my charter there in a consulting capacity was to size up their engagement, audit their meetings, audit their the way the work was flowing through the program, and to make recommendations for how to get back on track and on budget and on schedule to not only deliver what they were supposed to deliver, but actually to like be agile. Anyway, the point isn't so much the nature of my work, but rather a conversation I had that I actually forgot about, but years later I happened to bump into somebody that brought it up to me, and it was kind of like an interesting standout that this person remembered it, and I have since remembered it because of that. And the gist of it was one of the recommendations that I probably made was to bring in what was called a reference team. And to understand what this means, Pillar was mostly a custom app dev shop that sometimes, through me or otherwise had a flavor of consultants, either employed or subcontracted to like me, that would come in and do consulting work. But mostly what they were selling is application development labor. They were, like any custom app dev shop, typically making most of their money in margin by selling teams of software engineers. In this case, generally talented, highly skilled ones, because Pillar's MO was to hire people that really strongly believed in extreme programming principles and software craftsmanship, I believe this was called at the time. So like talented software developers, and then sell their labor. I mean, I don't think they would have liked to think of it that way because, and this is where the conversation came up, like most custom app dev body shop type places, they call all of their people consultants, even when they're not consulting. I've also written about this at length on my blog. It sounds good, our people aren't just programmers, they're consultants, or like, whatever. So it is a positioning play. I don't begrudge. I think all custom app dev shops do this, but to the programmer, that is a fairly confusing situation. So here I am on site, having come out of a meeting with some executives, and I was eating lunch with these folks, this reference team. Oh, I think I forgot to describe what a reference team is. So the reference team concept, just briefly, is you put this group of talented Pillar software developers into the client environment, and the Pillar software developers are used to things going smoothly. They're used to being able to decide their own tools, have meetings, and not deal with the typical bureaucratic corporate insanity that you would find at a bank. So the reference team comes in, and somebody once described this to me very aptly as putting a Ferrari out on like a street to like find the potholes in the street. You're going to find it real fast. So you put the reference team in, and they quickly surface all the things that they're unhappy with and that are blocking them. And then once you blast through that with some organizational air cover, the reference team starts to work in a way that the other teams emulate. This tactic works with varying degrees of success in varying organizations, beyond the scope of this video. But we had such a reference team here. So, it is these folks who are told they're consultants and they go on site to write software. And then there's me coming out of a meeting with the executives, and we were having lunch. And something came up along the lines of, I don't remember the exact conversation, but one of the software developers was essentially asking they bring in and ask for advice, and they listen to you. I'm also a consultant, but when I, talk about, how the CI/CD should be structured or whatever, people don't listen to me. Why is that? And I remember saying something at the time, and this is the part I don't exactly remember, but that he would bring up to me later in a form of a quote was like, if you go on site and you program, you write code, you're not a consultant, you're a developer with an opinion. And I probably didn't just say that like flippant and frankly sort of rude response, but I probably went on to elaborate on the problem here. And this was memorable to him years later, which was kind of cool. The problem is really in the expectation of the client. So to the client, I am there, me, Eric, was there to give advice. And in the client's mind, the programmers there, whatever you want to call them, consultants or otherwise, were there to execute programming labor. So this took the form of unsolicited advice. And the reason I'm calling this flippantly a developer with an opinion is every engineer in that bank's organization probably has some kind of opinion about how to do CI/CD, just like every engineer from this custom app dev shop probably has some opinion about it. They're all just, people that are doing labor and have opinions. Everybody has opinions. So the less flippant version of this was I was brought in and expected to give advice. Everybody else is just offering unsolicited advice if they're there to do labor. And that's the essential difference. So the sort of flippant but sort of not flippant response to this is if you want to be considered a consultant, don't write software, like don't write code. And I even wrote about that on my blog. I think I literally titled the post something like, if you want to be a consultant, don't write code. So this gets to the crux of what we're talking about here. I later went on to write another blog post that I remember describing a situation where I said, it was a hyperbolic example. Imagine that like Leonardo da Vinci had invented a time machine and time traveled from the late 1400s to now, and that Leonardo da Vinci was deciding to be sort of low key and earn a living as a plumber. But he's still Leonardo da Vinci with all kinds of inventions and art and all sorts of other stuff. This is a human being you should probably listen to about anything he has to tell you. But now imagine that you call your local plumbing company about a leaky toilet and they send Leonardo out, but you don't know that he's Leonardo da Vinci. You just know that he's your plumber. So he comes and he fixes your toilet. And then on the way out, he walks by and he sees some code up on your screen and he says, hey, I've got some advice. You want to hear what I think about how you're writing that particular class? Your answer to the plumber is going to be trying to keep a straight face and saying, no, thanks, buddy. Why don't you stick to the plumbing? I got it. Even though he's Leonardo da Vinci, and I assume in this alternate universe I've created, he's also figured out how to program very well in his spare time. And his advice would be excellent because he's Leonardo da Vinci and he's a genius. You're still not going to listen because he's the plumber. You just brought him here to fix the toilet. You're not looking for programming advice from the plumber. So all of that kind of winding narrative example is to sort of set the stage for the problem that you're asking about if you're asking this question, which is, I am going from gig to gig programming. And what if I also offered advice? Would that be a good value add? And the answer is no, because when somebody is hiring you for labor, they are almost by definition not interested in your advice. They are putting you into a bucket. That is the labor bucket, not the strategy bucket. So you're going to have a deeply uphill slog if you want to try to convince them to listen to your advice. So, could this work every now and then? Sure, why not? You might get some people that are receptive to ideas. They're in the particular mode to listen to some unsolicited advice. They're, having a beer after work and you say, I think it would be a great idea if you did X, Y, and Z. They're receptive and they're like, wow, that is, a great idea. Thanks for that advice. They're probably not going to pay you for that because that's a whole other thing, but like they might listen to you, but most likely they will not listen to you. Because why would they? It's the Leonardo problem. When Leonardo, the plumber, offers you unsolicited programming advice, what you would rationally be thinking to yourself is, even if this sounds like good advice, why would I listen to you? Because if you were a decent programmer, wouldn't you be programming? It probably pays more than plumbing. It's probably viewed as a higher status type of activity. I'm not looking to get into a judgment of like what trade and craft is better than what, but this is what you will be facing. Consulting is usually perceived, strategy is usually perceived as higher pay, higher leverage, higher prestige type of work than labor. So if you are kind of toiling away in labor land, people are going to be hard pressed to want to listen to you because if your advice was any good, wouldn't you be giving it for a living? So this is why I say it's not going to work. It's not really a particularly compatible pair of offerings. The other thing is, and I do want to give this some treatment here, is it probably won't actually be good for your client, even assuming you can convince them to listen to you and even assuming you can convince them to pay you, neither of which is a given. The reason I say that it won't be good for your client is you, if you are a freelance programmer, almost certainly have a long history of not doing consulting and not giving advice for a living. So number one, you're probably not very good at it. No offense, it's a skill you can build, and I'll get to this in a moment. So just right out of the gate, most likely what you're doing is just offering opinions rather than valuable advice. The other piece of this is, let's say even in some case it was a good, valuable opinion. What you likely are not experienced doing as somebody who doesn't frequently offer advice is contextualizing the opinion. So it's easy for people, especially if you've been an individual contributor or if you have, spent your career mostly in labor, to think of this general idea of maybe an idea meritocracy. So you see a process, maybe a team somewhere is deploying code like manually, and you say, hey, you can automate that. Like, it could be faster, it could be more efficient, it could save you a little bit of money. So there's this idea that since that is a good idea, it should be done, it should be offered to them as advice, etc. What you might not realize is in this day and age, there is a pretty good chance that if they're not doing an automated deployment, it isn't because they're not aware that's a thing. There is something else going on. They've tried it and it failed. They have some VP that is for some reason completely against it. They intend to do it already. It's just not as important as some fires they're putting out. If you start to sort of blindly offer advice and unsolicited opinions, which is probably what we're talking about here, if you're talking about bolting on your opinions to labor, you will most likely not even think to try to grab that context. And generally and broadly, you will not understand that clients usually are not lacking in execution because nobody's ever thought of the thing that you've thought of. Somebody has probably thought of it. There is an adage and a joke about consulting that their job is often to read your watch and tell you what time it is. And there is truth to that in various ways. And part of that truth is that it is unlikely you're thinking of something that nobody in that organization has ever thought of before. So what you really need to be doing as a consultant is discovering why this hasn't been implemented, understanding the context, and then giving them actionable advice and exposing trade-offs. And none of that is the kind of thing that you just kind of start doing in your spare time on top of labor. It is a skill. You have to learn to interview people, look for signs, look for subtle context and cues, etc. So you probably, wind up giving bad or redundant or non-actionable advice if you try to do this. And again, it's not because you don't have good ideas. It's because you don't have a long history of being a consultant. There is also a tendency for somebody who is doing app dev or somebody who is doing any kind of labor and wants to consult. One of the things you will do, one of the anti-patterns that you will most likely execute is one that small custom app dev shops, Pillar included back in the day, do all of the time, which is that they start to view strategic advice as tip of the spear to then sell a whole bunch of labor. Now, imagine your life as a freelancer. What you probably do is have 2, maybe 3 gigs a year. And maybe that's even more than you want because you don't really like sales and interviewing and like finding gigs. So you're looking to make your gigs as long and high touch and sort of tactical as possible, that you're just developing a relationship with this client indefinitely. That's the labor model. The consulting sales model is, it's very high leverage and usually short in duration, or long in duration, but short in the hours per week of the engagement. That would probably be a retainer. So what I mean is, as a consultant, you're probably going to come in, this is the style of consulting I would often do back in the day, come in for a week or two, maybe a month at most, like in the bank I was mentioning. I think I did that for like a month. And you hit a problem very hard and in depth. You help them make or reach a decision or assess a problem, and then you're gone. It is not a long-term type of engagement. Or you might have a series of clients that you give advice to on a retainer basis, and maybe you talk to them a few hours a week each. Either way, your book of business for a consulting practice is going to be more like 10, 15, 20 clients in a year. So the model of these two businesses is different. If you are trying to occupy both worlds, you are going to have a natural incentive to use your consulting to sell them your labor. And that might not be good advice. It's often not good advice when custom app dev shops do it in a lot of cases, but at best it's conflicted. So it might be good advice, but it's the mechanic who volunteers a free alignment check and then, oh, your alignment's off, I should fix that for you. So it's the wrong kind of set of incentives if on the tail end of this consulting work you're doing, you are going to sell them a whole bunch of Rails development. And you might say, no, I would manage that conflict of interest. I wouldn't give them bad faith advice. If they shouldn't hire a Rails developer, I would tell them that. And yes, that's true. It's going to be true in the obvious cases. You, dear watcher, listener, I'm assuming are a good person. You wouldn't knowingly give them bad advice. But you're a Rails programmer, you're holding a Rails-shaped hammer and everything looks like a nail. What can't you use Rails development for? You can automate anything. You can save cost on anything. You could build their own CI/CD custom solution. There are so many things you could do. Your brain is going to work very hard to find ways that you could be useful to them, and then you're going to sell them that. So there is an inherent conflict of interest. It's not that you're going to do wrong by them, but the model, the incentives are wrong. If you are even tempted to tee up your consulting as a way to sell a much more stable long-term app dev engagement. And also, it's such an anti-pattern for small consultancies because you slide down the org chart. As soon as you start selling more and more and more labor, where you were talking to a VP initially, they hand you off to a director who hands you off to a manager, and then eventually some architect is grading your programming work, and you start to wonder, why has the VP lost my phone number? That will happen too. But in the more immediate concern, what I'm talking about here is that conflict for the client. So bolting on advice to programming as a business, you're not experienced at consulting, so it's probably not a great idea for the consultant or for the client for you to be trying to be a consultant. You're not going to have that context. You're probably going to waste their time, and you will most likely have a conflict if you're trying to do these two awkward things together at once. If you're going to be a consultant, you can maybe occupy both worlds for variety, but I would consult with your consulting clients and do labor for your labor clients, and ne'er the twain shall meet. I don't want to make this way longer than all of my other videos, but I do want to, maybe offer some thoughts on what you should do instead here. The true north, if you are going to get into the business of consulting, it isn't going to be by doing labor and forming opinions about the good way to do the labor, which design patterns to use, and don't do global state, and you should do TDD and all this type of stuff. That is not the path to true consulting joy. You can become a consultant, as in, if you do that enough, if you express opinions enough on the internet, and they're strong opinions, people might gradually come to regard you as an expert of sorts, like kind of a generalist expert in Rails development or something. And then they might be inclined to ask you for advice on Rails programming. You can kind of sort of get there with a pretty low local maximum. But what you wind up doing when you take that type of approach is you become the Scrum certified consultant. And that's the kind of person that goes out and takes a weekend training course or whatever you have to be a Scrum master. And then you go to every organization with the Scrum hammer, and all problems are Scrum nails, and you do Scrum for everything, and you write blog posts about how you use Scrum for your family's chores. And suddenly, you know what everybody should do without ever listening to them for even a second. You know what they should do. It's your playbook. You risk becoming that type of consultant, which is often a charlatan, or at best, it's a very specific quasi-labor, quasi-consulting. It's not a great place to be. I mean, you can earn a living doing it, but kind of wind up being a blowhard, frankly. And it's got a shelf life. You turn over. You can't. The people I see doing that as consultants, they have to hop a lot from gig to gig, and not in a good way. Like, people get tired of their shtick. So I wouldn't do that. The true north for you as a consultant is you need to become the sort of person that people ask for advice from. Not the sort of person that has a lot of opinions and shares them. You need to contrive of a way that people come to you and they say, hey, what should I do about X? Or do you have experience with this? I'm thinking of this, etc. And I don't mean that they ask a forum that you're in. I mean that people actually come to you and ask you for advice. And if you want an example of this, I can give a couple from my past. Number one is this giant backlog of questions I have from writing the Dead Tech blog. So over the years, a lot of people write to me and ask, should I incorporate, what should I do about X, Y, and Z? It happens in the community. It happened for a lot of years with the YouTube channel I had for Dead Tech, the blog, etc. By creating a lot of content, people started to regard me as someone worth asking for advice. This is a subtly different thing than me just spewing opinions and then taking those opinions and sharing them with anyone who would listen, which could be a thing I would have done, especially with like some of my rants. Nobody came and asked me what an expert beginner was or whatever. But what did happen is, because I wrote about these topics, people would write in and say, what would you do about X? Or how do you recommend I handle asking for a promotion? When people come to you and ask for your opinion, that is signal, because it tells you that people value your opinion enough to listen. And once they do that, it's only a matter of time before they are willing to pay. Somebody is willing to pay you for your opinion, and then you are a consultant. The other thing I did that I've talked about in videos, I'm sure before, is probably 10 years ago, I started to do office hours at a startup incubator. So I would sit there for 2 hours, and there were half-hour slots. And I was kind of a rent-a-CTO. The startup founders would come and ask me, like, should I offshore this MVP, or should I do something else? I hired this bad developer. How should I deal with it? All kinds of questions like this. And I would take my best crack at answering them. And it is absolutely a skill that you can cultivate. If you had recorded these sessions, I bet in the beginning there were a lot where I would kind of say, like, whoa, I don't know. You should probably go ask someone smarter than me about this. And then probably by the end, if it would be more like, well, I don't know, but let's break this down to its components, figure out where the uncertainties and risks are, and then kind of talk through this together and give you a plan of attack. So you get a lot of experience getting asked about things. You will start to get very good at the contextualization that I mentioned, assessing people's problems quickly, assessing what they've already tried, doing discovery, and then offering meaningful solutions along with kind of risk-benefit analysis and contingencies in the whole 9 yards. So if you find a way to become somebody that people ask for advice, you are on the road to consulting. More tactically, what I would recommend doing is trying to build up both a public and visible area of expertise, and a repeating pattern of engagements that you have delivered. Like, for instance, a productized service might be a great way to do this. So let's go back just off the cuff to the CI/CD kind of example that I was talking about before. If you want to become somebody that gives consultative advice around, deploying software, then the best thing you could maybe do is stand up a landing page where you offer like a CI/CD process audit, and then start writing content about CI/CD and see if you get people that are paying attention to that content and asking questions. Now, just the fact that they're asking questions doesn't mean you turn around and start running a meter. Start answering those questions to the best of your ability. Build up the expertise. See what people are wondering about. Try to execute a few of your productized services, consulting around CI/CD, or, try to get involved if you're just doing gig-based labor, try to get involved in the CI/CD discussion at client sites or whatever the case may be. Build up a series of war stories on that topic, build up a corpus of content on that topic, and see if people find your insights valuable enough to start asking you questions. All of those things together will start to set you on the road to actual consulting, where somebody will eventually call you up and maybe even surprise you by not doing your productized service and saying, look, I'm considering technologies A, B, and C. What if I paid you like $5,000 to just tell me which one to use? You'll get a call like that sooner or later. And before you know it, you will actually be consulting, because people will actually want your opinions, because you've had enough at bats and enough practice and enough discussion and enough insights to have opinions that are valuable. But you don't get that by being a generalist. You don't get that by formulating and expressing the kind of opinions that everybody in their company already has. So if you want to give people advice about CI/CD, which tool should they use? Right now, any developer in their organization has an opinion about that. You're just another developer with another opinion. So you need some kind of book of work, or body of work, or you need some kind of credible public expertise, or some reason that your opinion is more valuable than just kind of the water cooler and peanut gallery opinions that everybody else will have. So that was a pretty long one. I did my best not to make it overly long, but this is a topic I have written about, talked about, lived from both sides. So I definitely have a lot of, meta, a lot of experience on this topic, giving this type of advice and doing it myself. So a lot to say here. Hopefully that is helpful, or at least interesting. I don't know, maybe you want to yell at me in the comments, either in the community or on YouTube. But feedback welcome, and I definitely hope this is helpful to the question asker, and I will catch you all next time.